I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside. It's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off-road. The guy managed the group. He was like, what are you doing in this beautiful car? I'm like, I'm going off-road. He's like, are you sure? Because you can use one of ours. And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
Capella University is rethinking higher education. With its game-changing FlexPath learning format, you can earn your degree on your schedule and fit your education seamlessly into your life. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show on the Choose Yourself Network. Today on the James Altucher Show.
The 10 commandments of the con artist, going back to your question on what we can learn. And one of them was a con artist isn't a great talker. A con artist is a great listener. And that's, it's a con artist commandment, but that's actually a really wonderful insight into human relationships.
This is why I think when I'm reading the book, I felt like, oh my gosh, am I a victim or am I a con artist? A lot of these techniques, they're also used in very positive situations.
Absolutely.
Like you don't mention it in the book, but this exact technique is used by Benjamin Franklin. There's so many stories of cons in the book, by the way. It's like an encyclopedia of con artistry.
Let me send you the hundreds of pages that didn't make it in.
All right. So I've got the smartest person that I've ever had on this podcast in this room, Maria Konnikova, author of The Confidence Game, Why We Fall For It Every Time, and also How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. I might be getting the actual title of that wrong. Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. Maria, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, James.
And Maria, you, I want to get into the books, and particularly The Confidence Game, because I feel when I was reading the book, two things happened to me. One is I realized I probably have been conned almost every single day, all of my life. Like there's so many cons I've fallen for, like both big and small.
Yeah.
But then the other thing I felt when I was reading the book is I kept thinking to myself, oh no, am I a con man? Like I got like really paranoid reading it, but we'll get to that. I want to go into your background first. You're from Russia?
Yeah.
Initially?
I was born in Moscow.
Moscow.
Yeah.
When did you move to the United States?
Still the Soviet Union, 1988. So before the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And then, I wanted to ask you, it seems like you're obsessed with this kind of out-of-the-box observation and thinking, which occurs both in the show, when you show people how to think like Sherlock Holmes. Obviously, he's a great capital O observer. And in terms of trying to analyze confidence games, con artists, swindlers, and so on, both from the point of view of the con artist and from the point of view of the victim, a lot of it is about how we can observe what is happening around us, how we can be mindful without just slipping into these traps. Do you think that comes from a little bit, this interest from your background growing up a little bit in the Soviet Union, where in some sense the system itself was conning the population?
Absolutely. I mean, you should hear some of the discussions around my dinner table when I was growing up.
What was the topic?
So my parents weren't dissidents, but they were people who really disagreed with the Soviet Union. And so I grew up with this awareness of just how fragile kind of the things that we take for granted here really are, and how, how easy it is to get into a world where people can't even trust members of their own family, where you can't talk about anything. I remember I was very little when we left, but I remember being told that I wasn't allowed to tell anyone that we were leaving because they could refuse our request to leave.
Were your parents scared?
Yeah. They were, so they didn't want me to talk about it. And I remember getting directives, you can't talk about it. I didn't know any better, so at some point I think I blurted out, "We're going to America."
Uh-oh.
That was.
Did your parents hit you after that?
No, my parents never hit me. But, it is such a different world. Even today, I think we're going back to Soviet times in some ways with Putin.
Really?
Yeah, he's scary. He's KGB.
And now a lot of people though are also in America. You must notice people are also critical of America, and nothing wrong with that. It's freedom of speech in America. You're allowed to leave this country, for instance, but there's still room for criticism. Do you think that in some sense there's equivalent propaganda in the United States against its people, or is totally different?
I think it's totally different. I think we feel that it's the same because we've never known anything else. But I think that we don't understand what a truly closed society is like. And it's a qualitative difference, not a quantitative difference. And so people here are free to criticize. No one's being thrown in jail. Nobody is being, shut up. No newspapers are being closed down, at least for now.
Every now and then there's an attempt, like you could think of Watergate and the Washington Post.
But we know about it. That's the
Right.
thing. And other newspapers cover it, and then people are held responsible. In the Soviet Union and in Russia today, I don't think people... You don't have that freedom. You don't know about it. And people are just shut up and thrown in jail for spurious causes, or not thrown in jail, but they'll never really say their true opinion. And I think that's very scary. It's a society that's really muted from the top.
And again, do you think this kind of, am I making too much of a leap by saying this triggered your interest in ways in which we're affected by not only societal propaganda, but almost human propaganda? The way con artists swindle their victims is almost like creating this human propaganda machine.
Absolutely. No, I do think it influenced it. I think the other influence was the fact that I didn't speak any English when I came. And so I was always very conscious of language and of the power of language and what language can do, and how the ability to communicate can really open up so much for you. Language is power and words are power. Not having it, I remember feeling so incredibly powerless. I couldn't do anything. And so that was something that really, I think, was always a driving force for me and made me incredibly open to those minor influences. And if you think about con artists, their greatest gift and tool is language, storytelling, how they use words to kind of weave a tale for us and to really draw us in.
It's funny because storytelling, people forget this is the main way for tens of thousands of years or millions of years even that information was transferred from generation to generation. It wasn't just, don't go over there in the woods. It was like the last time someone went over there, demons came out and chewed them up and danger happened. So it was always like a story to incite emotions, so that it was enough to A, educate, and B, transfer down even to further generations. So the way our species survived is through storytelling. And so it's funny how these things that were so positive, we wouldn't be storytellers unless there was a positive evolutionary reason for it, and yet these are the exact things that allow people to be both victims and con artists. Like, we hear a story, we believe it, we tell a story, we manipulate it, and so on.
I think that's absolutely right. And storytelling is a very basic, I think, human instinct, human need. It's a very basic part of our humanity. And it is incredibly evolutionarily beneficial. There's a reason that stories have evolved, have survived. You can imagine people around, campfires before language was really inventing acting out stories. If you actually look at some of the data on communication, it ends up that our nonverbal cues are much stronger than our verbal cues, that we can actually get a lot of context and a lot of story without any words whatsoever. So I think it predates so much else that has happened in human cognition and human evolution.
Well, it's interesting because then I want to get into some of the specifics of a lot of the cons that you bring up in the book, The Confidence Game, but it does sort of blur the line between what's a con and what's honesty and truthfulness. And I think that's what, of course, con artists take advantage of, is that line is blurred. It's no one, it's very hard to point a finger even to this day and say, okay, that's a con and this is truthful, because marketing, of course, is all, and sales is all in that gray area. But and religion, of course, is in that gray area. And you point out the quote from Voltaire, although you mentioned it could have been from many other sources, religion started when the first fool met the first scoundrel. So, and that's kind of the case with all cons.
Yeah.
So give us an example of like a con. You have a couple of favorites in the book. I mean, there's so many, by the way, con artists and swindles that you mentioned in the book. It begs the question, which maybe we can address later, how many uncaught cons and swindles are happening right now in the world? Because obviously the ones who are caught are the ones you write in the book, but the million that haven't been caught are still out there.
Absolutely right. I mean, the number is astronomical. We have no good statistics about the prevalence of con artists because the vast majority is never caught.
I mean, and just in
good.
the past day, you're just looking at email, you see, I did the exercise after reading the book, just how many possible cons were in my email.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. And I'm just talking about my friends and family.
I got
then there's
conned
all
yesterday.
the email phishing and spamming and all that that get you. But okay, so what are some of your favorite cons in the book?
Well, I think my absolute favorite is the one that I open with, Ferdinand Waldo de Mara, the great imposter, because he operated for decades. So we think of Frank Abagnale and Catch Me If You Can. That guy was caught after 2 years. He wasn't.
Really? He was only active for 2 years?
Maybe it was 3, but it was just in his teens. It was just a few years. And he did a lot in those years, but he was caught. And de Mara kept getting caught and kept doing it through the 80s. I mean, the guy was operational during my lifetime.
Okay, and I'm gonna get into the specifics on that one.
Yeah.
So he what he was really good at was taking on a new identity, a new job. Like he was a doctor in a war situation.
Yeah.
He was a Texas prison warden. He was running a religious monastery or various religious things. And this is going to sound like an odd question, but what did he do that was bad?
Well, he pretended to be a surgeon. He had
but
never
he did
finished.
Successfully.
We don't know that.
Okay.
So here's the thing. So we have his account, and we know that nobody died aboard the ship. But as I point out, everyone left. So all of the people on whom he operated left the ship right after the surgery. And he had plied them with so many antibiotics and so much stuff to actually prevent anything bad from happening right there. So who knows, 24 hours later, maybe some of them did die.
But he was the only one
know.
willing to operate on them. He was the only surgeon around. Like they would have definitely died if he wasn't there.
This is true. But, would they have if they had medical supplies and someone was willing to clean their wounds, someone who didn't actually cut them open, and to send them to a ship that did have doctors? I mean, there were other ships in North Korea.
So the fact that he was claiming to be a doctor kind of maybe everybody said, "Oh, send these guys to this guy with the doctor."
Surgeon.
So that might have been the bad thing that happened there.
So I think it's and he got very lucky, obviously, but I think it's very scary to think that somebody without a high school education who's never performed any form of surgery whatsoever is going to cut you open. And think about his narcissism, kind of the playing God type of thing, to say, "Oh, I can do that," no problem.
I guess in all of the kind of fraud situations that he was in, it was this kind of almost psychological playing God dynamic he was playing out. Like being a prison warden means you're in charge of thousands of prisoners.
Yep.
Being a head of a monastery, of course, is playing out some kind of religious theme.
Yeah, bodies, souls,
yeah.
everything.
And so even though he wasn't necessarily swindling people out of money, although we don't really know, he was kind of playing out some emotional need in himself.
Yes.
And I don't know, you've certainly seen a picture of him. It wasn't in your book, but I've looked up a picture.
Yeah.
He's a huge, massive guy.
He is huge. He is not someone who looks particularly trustworthy. He has these tiny eyes and a huge face.
Yeah, this huge, triangular face.
Yeah. And yet people trusted him, loved him. His biographer, Robert Crichton, kept believing in him, even though he kept conning him. Now, he conned Crichton out of a lot of money. Crichton kept giving him money, cash, every single day. He bought him a car. He paid for his education so that he could actually be a religious leader. And every single time, de Mara would let him down and become a con artist again because he loved it. I think he loved that power over other people.
So in what sense was de Mara a skilled con man? So if I were to kind of go out there and say, "Oh, hey, I'm a doctor, I'll do surgery," people are just going to believe me. I don't necessarily have to do any kind of particular persuasion. And if I read the Bible, I can go and say, oh, I could be the head of, I'm a trained priest or monk or whatever. So what were the skills he was using, or was he just like a pathological liar?
No, he was definitely incredibly skillful. He could persuade people of just about anything, even when they had evidence to the contrary.
How?
He was very good at, at basically reading other people so that he could then use that to reflect their best self on them. So let me give you the example of Crichton. He said, I chose you because you're the best writer, and I know that you're the right person to tell my story. I chose you. And so Crichton right away wants to show him in a positive light. Crichton actually went through 2 drafts of The Great Imposter, and the first one was not very positive. And then he threw it out because he decided that it was wrong, that DeMar was really a good guy. And so it's one of those things where it's not just flattery, it's also true empathy in some sense because, DeMar listens. He knows that Crichton's, wife is pregnant and that he's very nervous and he's worried about her. So he talks about that a lot. He actually employs skills that we'd be well placed to employ in our day-to-day interactions.
Like how?
Because it's good to listen, right? And it's good to actually empathize with people and to hear what they're saying and to talk about them rather than talking about you. Most people don't like to do that. Most people like to talk about themselves, and most people don't actually listen when they ask a question.
And you kind of refer to this with also another con, and I remember this woman very clearly, or not the woman herself, but her location, always in the West Village, Sylvia Mitchell, the psychic.
Yes.
I always kept passing there for a decade thinking, boy, I just want to go in there just to see.
Yeah.
And I would look in the window and, I just wanted to see, but I never did it. But you mentioned in the story of her, and we could describe her story in a second, how important reading other people became for her con. Maybe describe that particular con.
Yeah, so she was able to convince, probably thousands of people over her career, but she's now in prison for two particular ones.
Is that place shut down? Is that location shut down?
No, it's still there.
Who's the psychic?
I'm not sure, but she has a large family. So Mitchell is actually a very common psychic name. It's an assumed name that a lot of Roma took when they came to the United States.
Why?
To be more American, to kind of. So there are lots of Mitchells who are psychics.
Why Mitchell and not Johnson or Smith?
I don't know. I wish I knew. But so it's still operational, but now it's been rebranded a little. It just says Z, not Xenia. So I'm not sure if the lawsuit has anything to do with it. But the women that she ended up swindling for this particular lawsuit were really smart. One of them worked in Goldman Sachs. One of them ran kind of this ballroom dance publicity company. So really kind of educated, intelligent women. And she was able to convince them to give her tens, and in one case, hundreds of thousands of dollars to reverse curses in past life and do all of this stuff that looking at it from the outside, you think, how in the world is this possible?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I can't imagine walking into a situation like that and she would say, you have this too much attachment to money. Let me hold this $28,000 in a jar, and I'll give it back to you whenever you ask. And then, of course, you never gave it back. And I can't imagine handing someone $28,000 to hold in a jar for me.
Yeah.
But yet, like you said, these were very intelligent people, and you often point out that it's the smartest people that are easily conned.
Right.
So how does it? Do these people come in with the belief that there's in curses?
No. So when I spoke with Deborah Salfield, who is the woman who handed over $28,000, so we had this conversation, and she said, I don't believe in psychics. It was the worst day of my life. In 24 hours, she lost 2 jobs and her boyfriend, and she was basically at her emotional lowest point that she had been in, in who knows how long.
That happens to me every other week, so I feel like I'm prime for this. But
so she
ahead.
just decided to go in on a lark, but she really loved Sylvia. Sylvia was nice. She was empathetic. She listened. She looked really intelligent. She didn't look like she was going to swindle you, and she really made sense. She basically hit a lot of the right notes. She told, Deborah that she was a really kind of smart woman, that yes, bad things happen, but there's a reason for this and we can help you through it. In some ways it's a lot of non-psychic kind of but new agey type of movements they actually operate on a lot of the same principles. Let's work through this. We can work through your problems, and that's not necessarily bad. It's almost like a therapist, right? Someone who actually listens to you, who lets you talk, and who is able to reflect kind of the world that you want back to you. And so, Deborah, in the moment, we were talking earlier about storytelling and emotions. When you're in that situation and you're emotional, you don't necessarily think the way you would, 2 hours into the future when you've cooled off a little bit.
And you point out that often it's situation right then and not personality that drives the victim. But if someone's walking into a psychic's office, say, or place, they're probably more likely to be in a bad situation than other. Like happy people aren't going to a psychic. Yep. Sad people are going to a psychic. Like, help me. Is this situation I'm in going to get solved in the future?
Absolutely. It's one of those things where, well, it can't hurt, can it? Let me try everything. So, and it can hurt. They just don't realize it. And so I don't know if you've read this story. It wasn't in my book because it only happened a few months ago, of the Wall Street banker who got swindled by 2 psychics.
Oh, I didn't read
and
that.
he ended up dating one of them.
You're kidding.
Who then swindled him even further. And once again, you think, how? And yet, when you're in that situation, I've become really sympathetic to the victims, because it's slow. It's not like right away you say, give me $200,000. That's not how it works. It's a slow building of a relationship, slow building of trust, of someone, who you start feeling is a confidant, someone who you can go to, someone who understands you, someone who has some sort of deeper insight. And you have no idea how many times I've met people who said, I do not believe in psychics. I agree with you. There aren't any psychics, except my psychic is the exception. Wow. My psychic is the exception to the rule. And if everyone's psychic were the exception, then obviously everyone.
And you point out, like, Houdini was always trying, like the famous magician Houdini was always trying to expose psychics and mystics and so on, and he never once found a real psychic. And the amazing James Randi in current times is similar. Never was able to find a real psychic. Like, do you believe that there's anything like this at all?
No, I don't. I mean,
so in every case, it's basically a swindle.
I think so. Unless I am open-minded. If someone were to claim James Randi's prize, I would say I'm wrong.
Now, do you think any psychics believe they're psychics?
Yeah, I think some of them probably start believing at some point. Not all of them. Some of them are just ruthless. But I think that some of them probably end up saying, oh, there's something there. Think of it as, if you are a trader, right? You remember your good trades in the stock market, and you sometimes forget the bad ones. You said, oh, I knew that was coming. If you're a card player, say, I knew that ace was coming. I could sense it, because you forget all the times that you sensed the ace and it wasn't an ace. So there's this confirmation thing. So I think that some psychics end up thinking that they really do have deeper insight than many, and maybe some believe that they see the future.
Well, I guess also, I was thinking about this a long time ago. One time, a friend of mine who's a huge Wall Street banker, runs his own private equity firm, and he told me he owes his entire career to this one psychic. So he told me, go see her. So I go out to West New York or East New York, whatever New York that is, out in New Jersey, and go see her, and she tells me all this stuff. But what I really was struck though was by how this guy's a Harvard educated, like Harvard MBA, rose up huge in Wall Street, and yet he's still willing to believe in all this psychic stuff. And I was thinking to myself, there's this big confirmation bias, like. The psychic only hears from her successes. Right. If there's a failure, they kind of drop off, and so she never hears from them again. And he is only like if she happens to be the random person who told him a couple of things correctly, then of course, what else is he going to think? Oh, she knew the future. Yeah. So even if he went to 10 psychics, this is the one, one of them will accidentally hit on some right things.
Absolutely. And I wish I remember who said this. Some Wall Street guru at some point said, here's the key to making successful predictions. You always make 2 of them in opposite directions, and one of them will always be right. Yeah. And people will only remember the ones you got right. And so you'll be hailed as an oracle.
Well, there's a classic Wall Street scam where you send out predictions to 1,000 people, 500 have one prediction, 500 have the other. Yep. Now, for 500 of them, it's going to be correct, like you said.
Yep.
Then you send out 2 predictions again
Yep.
to 250 and 250 opposite
Yep.
predictions. And then, 250 are still going to think you're 2 in a row. And you keep on doing that until you have, like, let's say 10 people left and you've just made 6 correct decisions in a row. And now you sell some huge thing to them because they think you're like an oracle of Wall Street.
Yeah.
So that's like a classic Wall Street scam that I've never actually seen it happen,
That's
but it's
pretty great.
described. Yeah, we should try it. We'll go into business
Let's
together,
do
start a hedge
it.
fund.
Let's do it.
So what we're with Sylvia Mitchell also, you talk about the cold read, how some of these psychics are able to look at somebody and be really good or talented. There is some skill they develop at reading people.
Yes.
What are some of, and I'm just saying this selfishly now, how can I better read people? Again, not as a con person, but just in general, what is this skill?
Well, I mean, it's lots of skills. One of them is just being incredibly observant. So this goes back to Sherlock Holmes. Actually looking at all of the cues that people give off right away. So if I walk in, right away, I'm wearing certain things. I carry myself a certain way. I smile a certain way. And over time, you start learning that, she looks a little bit depressed. She looks like she didn't get enough sleep last night. Maybe something's on her mind. She looks really happy. Things are going well. And then you start doing, you don't get to the Holmes level of, you are going through a divorce and you have an alcoholic brother by looking at your watch. But it is something where you can get a lot of cues from people's appearance because we normally don't look at other people the way we look at ourselves. So when you look at yourself in the mirror, you see all the detail, the minute detail of your face. When you look at someone else, you don't actually pay that close attention. You kind of get an impression and that's it. But if you realize that that's the way that it works, you can right away flip it. You can say, okay, people aren't going to notice, that I look really tired. They're going to get that just impression of me. But let me look at them the way I'd look at myself in the mirror and try to read all of those cues. What
so
kind
how
of
do
a
you,
mood
how do you
are
do
you
that?
in?
Like you mentioned that in the book, and I didn't quite understand. Like, how does somebody look at another person the way that person would look at themselves in the mirror?
It's honestly just a switch of perspective. So rather than just kind of glance at you and be done with it, I really look at you. So, I really examine kind of all of the details. Did you polish your glasses?
Clearly not, by the way. It's all foggy and dirty.
So, things like that. And you actually start building a picture, but we're not silent. People talk. And the moment you start talking, you start throwing off so many clues that can be used in a cold read.
Like what?
The question you ask. So one of the first things that psychics ask you is there a particular question that you want to focus on today? Seems like a very innocuous question, right?
So let's say I say career.
Right. So that's what I said when I went for my fake psychic reading. Well, it was a real reading, but for me it was fake. So I
So you say.
So I say, although it was a very perceptive psychic. So you say career right away. Okay, I know a lot of things about you. I know that you are either, you are interested in career or career is important. It's somehow on your mind. I'm not a psychic, so I don't have as many data points as psychics. Or I can say, really you're not interested in career because nobody would come to me with a career question. You're probably interested in something else, but you're too embarrassed. You don't want to say love, so you're going to say career.
And how would I then make the connection to love or?
Well, then I start talking and I say, okay, let's do a tarot reading. Let's start looking at these cards, and I start looking at how you react to things. So if you think about like how good gamblers can sometimes read their opponents, you look at how they're reacting to different things that you're doing. Are you nodding? Do you kind of look skeptical? Are you leaning in? Are you leaning out? Did you cross your legs? Like, are you in a kind of closed off posture? Are you in a more open posture? Do you seem intrigued? Am I on the right track? So we do this all the time, unless you're really watching it. And even then, you might still be kind of throwing off some of these signals. I know right away if what I'm saying is actually making a connection. And if it's not, I switch tacks in such a way that you don't even realize I've done it.
So a friend of mine was telling me a story a few years ago. She went to a psychic and she had to drive like 300 miles to across a couple states. And the psychic supposedly didn't know her beforehand, but then accurately said something about a deceased relative that quote unquote nobody would have known, which is a common thing I hear.
Right.
How do they do stuff like that? And by the way, I'm not arguing for psychics.
Right.
I don't believe in psychics at all, particularly ones that are for sale. I mean, I say particularly, but I've never seen any evidence of any kind of psychic. But I'm always just curious. Like, it seems like a magic trick, but I can't figure out how they do it.
It's really hard. If I could do it, I'd make a lot of money. But so first of all, no one could have known it. Oftentimes they do have a confidant, and I wrote about a few people in the book where you had psychics who knew about the very intimate, specific details, and it ends up that the person who had recommended the psychic to this family had fed a lot of information.
And I was curious
psychic.
about that too. Did they feed because the psychic was paying them, or just they kind of just got into the psychic's magnetism and gave up this info?
I actually don't know. That's a really good question. And I'm guessing that they were being paid because this psychic had a lot of kind of cronies who did that sort of legwork for him because he was a holy man. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe it was kind of that magnetism. But so oftentimes you have something like that. These days, if you book the appointment under your real name, it's very easy to find a lot of things about you before the appointment. And if you're a good psychic, you're going to do that. You're going to not just use Google, but use public records. It's worth it for you to, pay $40 to get all of the records on somebody.
And I wonder if also there are just like common things that are true for like 95% of people.
There absolutely
so
are.
for instance, I was once reading about this sort of thing, and if you say to a woman, at some point in your childhood, your hair was cut really short and you were totally embarrassed about it, that's going to bring up some memories.
That happened to me.
Yeah, see, there you go. So there's like a bunch of things you can say that kind of establish this weird trust right away.
Absolutely. So there are things that are common to all people. There are things that you can sort of guess. If you're coming to a psychic, chances are something has happened. You can say, oh, somebody, close to you is either sick or maybe just passed away. And so you say, yeah, actually. And then right away you give them some information, and it's a very skillful setup because you give them two different outs. You say sick or, and right away you say, oh yeah, I saw some sort of change and I saw some illness. And so then they've given you the information, but you take credit for it. And it's very funny. I remember when I was reading about Conan Doyle, and one of the seances.
Author of all the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Yes, author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. So after his death, there were lots of seances to try to bring Arthur Conan Doyle back because he believed in this. This was part of the reason he fell out with Houdini. They used to be close friends. And then
so he was someone who was not only incredibly observant, was able to write about somebody incredibly observant, but towards the end of his life, because he had so much loss in his life, as you point out, he kind of fell into these mediums and parapsychologists and so on that took advantage.
And so there's this one scene where you see this psychic who is saying, oh, I feel the presence of someone, and the first name starts with an A. And then the person in the audience who wants Conan Doyle to come back actually starts thinking that they're talking to him because he identifies his part of the balcony, and he really did have someone die with a name, and it was everything matched up, and it ended. And then the person sitting 2 people away from him stands up and says, oh my God, that's me. So that's kind of going back to what you're saying, that especially if you have a lot of people, you're going to have pretty good hit rates, especially if you go slowly, because you start gauging people's reaction. Does the letter R mean anything to you? No, well, maybe, actually it's not an R. Wait, it's a B. I didn't quite see the bottom of it. Yes, the letter B means something to you. So you start doing that, and we are just, I'm certainly not aware of how many cues I throw off, but we don't realize how much people can tell about us. We think that we've been so great. We think we have a poker face when really we usually don't.
Well, it's so funny because you You bring up actually in the book a favorite example of mine, which you apply to several things, and the example is the myth of our own superiority in various things. So I always say, 9 out of 10 people think they're above average drivers,
Yeah.
and I'm actually the 1 out of 10 who knows he's a below average driver. Like my license
Yeah.
has been suspended and I never got it back, and I refuse to get it back because I know I will kill someone eventually. But this is true I noticed this in poker as well. Everybody thinks they're a great poker player. Like
Yep.
they just have to sit down and they're going to read everyone and they're going to be
Yes.
great. And I think in general, people think, and you pointed out again, we mentioned this earlier, but you pointed out that the smarter people tend to be more easily conned because they think they're so smart, they can't be conned.
Yep.
So the con artist is able to take advantage of that. And you have so many examples of it. But I guess there's this cognitive bias somehow that we have to think we're above average or else we'll just stay at home all the time and not do anything.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the only segment of the population that doesn't have this bias are the clinically depressed. And that's a big segment of the population. But that actually, that's really depressing. That's really sad. It shows that if you see yourself honestly, it's a depressing spectacle. It's really not good to really see an unvarnished version of yourself.
It's depressing or it's not in the sense that another area where this occurs, where you see yourself for all your faults, is when you truly love something and then you decide, okay, I'm going to try to get better at it.
Right.
Because by then you've developed taste,
Yep.
but not skill.
Yes.
So let's say you want to be a great painter because you love all these famous painters, and you finally get a set of paints and you start painting. You realize because you've loved all these painters, oh my gosh, I'm horrible. Like
Yes.
I'm just not as good at them. So you either at that point get depressed or you start working really hard and it becomes a passion pursuit for you.
Absolutely. No, I think that that's a very good point, that in isolated circumstances like that, it could actually be very helpful. So I've wanted to be a writer my whole life, from when I announced when I was 5 years old to my parents that I was going to be a writer. And somewhere in junior high, I said, I'm never going to write, because I started reading, Dostoevsky. I'm Russian. I grew up with, the Russian literature and Bulgakov and all of these books. And I said, okay, I'm never going to be able to do this. I give up. I'll just be a reader. And so for a number of years, I just read a lot. And then it came back. I couldn't resist it.
And then when you first started and you were first reading the things back to yourself, were you a little depressed, like it wasn't as good as Dostoevsky?
Oh, absolutely. I wanted to throw everything out. I want to throw everything that I've written out because, you keep getting better. And it's sometimes you write something and you're really proud of it. And you're like, this is good. And then a year later you come back and you say, no, I'm so much better now. And there are definitely things that I wish I had never published.
It's like, what do you wish you never published?
Well, I wish...
Not the Sherlock Holmes book.
No, I'm glad I published it, but I wish I could have done more with it. I feel like it didn't live up to its potential. And I feel like that about a lot of the things that I've written. There's some of the things, like when I just started blogging, back in 2005, I would have probably taken back some of those early blog posts, but they're alive and well. You can find them.
Oh, well, I'm going to take a look for them. I did not look for those in preparation for this. Let's stop to take a quick break. We'll be right back. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get two memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. Oracle.com/advance.
So a lot of the people who fell for the cons are falling for very simple cognitive biases.
Yeah.
And kind of this sunken cost bias was a
Huge
big
one.
one. Maybe, and it occurs across almost all of these cons, but maybe you can describe that a little bit and some
Yeah.
of the ways con artists take advantage of that.
Absolutely. So it's something that actually applies to all areas of life. When you've already invested something in a project, in a relationship, in any sort of endeavor, and it doesn't have to be financial, it can just be time, it can be effort, you don't see it as you don't see it as something that's separate from your future decisions. You see your future decisions as totally linked to what you've already done. And so you think that, well, even if the right decision objectively is to kind of give up and to realize this isn't working, I'm not going to do that because I've already sunk so much into it. So it's called the sunk cost fallacy. Because of that, once we've committed resources, we want to keep going. It's really hard for us to stop. And this happens in everything. I mean, you see it in bad relationships. You have relationship inertia where people said, but we've already, I can't get out.
We've already spent 2 years together.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got to try to work on this.
Exactly. We've been together for too long.
Story of my life.
Exactly. Well, no, I mean, so I think it's very important to note that it's not just, I've already, invested thousands of dollars in this. It can be an emotional investment.
And it occurs very much in the investment industry. Speaking of the word investment,
Yeah.
because you might own, let's say, a stock, and people. A common advice is look at your stocks every day as if you don't own them, and
Yeah.
would you buy them today? But most of the time, people can't do that. They say, "Oh, I own it, and I'm down
Yeah.
30%. I have to at least get my money back."
Yes.
And they have that skewed bias.
And it's really hurtful. It makes you make bad decisions because that's not the way that you should be deciding. I mean, you should be deciding based on the information today, not based on the information however many years ago. And information gets constantly updated.
So how do con artists take advantage of the fact that this cognitive bias exists to basically initiate and do their cons?
Well, so they make you invested in a situation. It can be in their friendship. It can be they're building a relationship, and so then it gets uncomfortable. You can't say no to them because you feel like you'd be letting them down. It might be financial. So there are some con artists I write about in the book who actually get you to kind of give them a little bit of money, but then you're already invested because and it's not just the investment, it's also confirmation, because if you helped someone out in the past, that means they're worth it. That means they're a good person, so you should keep helping them out. So this is, I think, what happened with Crichton and Damara. So because he'd given him money, because he'd helped him, that was already kind of something that he needed to keep doing in the future to prove to himself that he'd made the right decision initially.
I mean, it feels like there's an opposite thing, though, whereas if someone gives you money, too, you feel obligated to help them. So whether you give the money or whether you get the money, it seems like there's different biases that maybe work in both in the same way.
Unless you're a con artist, in which case you don't care because
Right.
you know exactly what you're doing. So you don't feel any obligation. So that's why there's a quote from a con artist, and I don't remember if I quoted him in the book or not, but it's basically the moment that you feel sympathy for your victim, you're dead in the water. That's what you can't do. You can't, as a con artist, you can't feel any obligation. You have to make them feel obligation.
But, I feel like, so this is why I think when I'm reading the book, I felt like, oh my gosh, am I a victim or am I a con artist? Because a lot of these techniques that we're calling them techniques, but they're also used in very positive situations.
Absolutely.
Like you don't mention it in the book, but this exact technique is used by Benjamin Franklin, right? So I don't know if you know that story. He's a young guy. He has an enemy in the Pennsylvania State Assembly, and this guy totally hated Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin did something very simple. He asked the guy to borrow, if Benjamin Franklin could borrow a book from him. Benjamin Franklin borrowed the book and then returned it, and then the guy was friends with him ever after.
Yeah.
Because he figured in his mind, oh, I did this favor for
Yep.
Benjamin Franklin, so I must like him.
That's absolutely right.
So did Benjamin Franklin, would you say he conned this guy? Because
A
he did
little
it
bit.
kind of on purpose to
A little bit.
buy friendship.
A little bit. So that's, so it's consistency, which is sort of a sunk cost, but a little bit different. So there are two different elements going on here. But yeah, I mean, so the way that I differentiate, because a lot of these techniques you do see in the legitimate world, as well as the world of the con artist, is intent. And was your intention benign or malicious? I think in Franklin's case, I mean, it does look a little bit cold-blooded, but I think it's ultimately still probably benign. He wasn't trying to do it. He wasn't trying to take advantage of this guy.
So okay, so that's interesting though. What separates, let's say, the con artist from Benjamin Franklin being intent? So the con artist, you can argue, in let's say 90% of cases, is trying to get money, kind of, let's say, illegally or under fraudulent circumstances. In 10% of the cases, it's like Damara, the first one you spoke about, who just wanted to fulfill some ego trip without worrying about the consequences. So there was some fraud happening. It's hard to distinguish what's crime and what's not, but it's definitely fraudulent. And what are more positive ways in which people can use some of these techniques to basically help their lives, make their lives better?
Well, I think that what we were talking about earlier in terms of listening is an incredibly important skill. So one of the commandments of the con artist, this con artist, Victor Lustig, Count Lustig.
Who's considered like the father of con artists.
He was a brilliant con artist in the 20th century, sold the Eiffel Tower twice, had this invention, the money box that printed out money, and ended up selling it to the sheriff of the town when he was in jail for selling money boxes. So this guy was very, very good. Conned Al Capone. I read about that in the book. But he had the commandments.
He was the one who it was genius, actually. Describe that con. Actually, it was genius.
So he came to Al Capone. And he said, Al, I've got a business proposition for you. If you lend me $10,000 or $20,000, I don't remember what the actual number was. Let's say $20,000, I'll double your money in a month. And Capone said, I know exactly who you are. I know you're a flim-flammer. Your reputation precedes you, but you know who I am. I'm Al Capone, so you're not going to mess with me. So here you go. Let's see what you can do. So Lustig takes the money. He puts it in a safety deposit box, and he goes back to New York, which is where he's based at the time. Month goes by, he comes back, takes the money out, goes back to Al Capone, gives him back the $20,000 and says, Al, I'm so incredibly sorry. I really needed the cash myself. I really thought I had a line on something, but it fell through. So here's your money back. I'm so sorry that I couldn't deliver. And Capone just sits there. He's flabbergasted. He said, I expected one of two outcomes. Either you would come back with nothing, you lost the money, or you would have doubled it because you would have had some sort of shady dealings. But by God, you're an honest man. Here to reward you for your honesty, since you said you were going through some financial difficulties, take $5,000. And from then on, you'll be my friend. I know that I can trust you, that you're honest. And that's what Lustig was after. He wanted that $5,000. And it's just it's brilliant.
It's so funny because that's a case where he needed to essentially purchase reputation from Capone and then trade it for a little bit of money. And that's the way he did it. So that was kind of this deeper
It's great.
con. And to some extent, Madoff operated under the same principle. It wasn't like he was doubling everybody's money every year. He had very just small but consistent returns.
Yeah.
So people who thought, oh my God, he must be a fraud, were probably fooled into thinking, he's... Who knows? Like, the returns were so small. It wasn't like fraudulent type returns, although it turned out to be.
Right. No, Madoff was incredibly smart in the way he did it. But yeah, Lustig had the 10 commandments of the con artist, going back to your question on what we can learn. And one of them was a con artist isn't a great talker. A con artist is a great listener. And that's, it's a con artist commandment, but that's actually a really wonderful insight into human relationships. How do you form a good relationship? You listen to other people. And so that, I think, is something that we can use, in building friendships and forming new bonds and actually kind of really getting to know people, being truly curious about them. Con artists really are curious about their victims because that's the way that they can profile them and take advantage of them. But you don't have to have that type of intent. Your intent can really just be curiosity for curiosity's sake. Let me get to know you. I'm curious to know who you are. I'd like to make a new connection. And so a lot of these things in the right hands can be really just powerful tools of human relationships.
And so what's another commandment?
I don't know what the other commandments are off the top of my head.
Because that one was pretty valuable. Now I need to know the other 9.
Yes. Now I
feel like now a podcast is like a con game because that's what a podcast is.
We can look up the other 9 commandments. Yes, I have them written down, but I don't remember them off the top of my head.
It seems with Madoff, too, there were a couple other things going for him. And you mentioned one of them, which is scarcity. Like, he was always saying you couldn't just put money in his fund. You had to essentially beg him to take your money. So that was another way. He's like, you in a weird way, build trust by creating scarcity.
Absolutely. Scarcity, exclusivity, those are things that really appeal to people. you want to be a member of a club that will have you, right? Right? It's a very basic kind of premise that if it's scarce, if it's exclusive, it must be good because I can't get in because it's a limited good. And so there was one guy a lot of cons didn't make it into the book.
There's so many stories of cons in the book, by the way. It's like an encyclopedia of con artistry.
Let me send you the hundreds of pages that didn't make it in.
All right,
You'll
I'll
have
read them.
lots of more. But there was this guy who did a rare book fraud, and that's a very similar principle. You can get a lot of money if you say, this is a one-of-a-kind, rare thing, because the correct type of person, kind of the bibliophile, the person who loves books, will pay a lot of money for that rare kind of exclusive copy. Scarcity, if you make something seem scarce, then of course it ends up in this con that it's not actually this rare book. But that feeling that you're getting a prize is really valuable. Some con artists do it. So one of the guys I write about, Matthew Brown, who pretended to be an aristocrat, he got all sorts of, connections, money. American Express and Barclays gave him credit cards because they thought that he was from an aristocratic background. This guy was good. I mean, he edited Wikipedia. He put himself into lineages. I mean, he actually created a trail for himself online, and never trust Wikipedia. But people...
Jimmy Wells has been on this podcast, by the way. He might disagree, but go ahead.
Well, you always double-check Wikipedia.
Right.
There's some amazing Wikipedia articles, but something like that, you don't catch that right away. It's not like there's an editor sitting there who says, is he really part of that lineage? Let's try to figure it out.
But that's interesting because social proof is also something that's very important in marketing.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's why in any, 9 out of 10 dentists say X, is a very strong marketing technique, and that's what he's basically doing. He's using other sources to validate his own existence and to make the con, but that's also used in marketing and sales.
Absolutely, and con artists do this all the time. DeMara called it papering, so he would paper his trail before he arrived anywhere. He'd write all the recommendations himself, but he'd have these wonderful inquiries and recommendation letters from all these luminaries sent to a university so that by the time he got there, people are like, oh, you're the famous DeMara, or whatever his name was at the time. We've heard so much about you. All of these people talk about you because social validation really matters. But that can be used, all of these things can be used for good. One of the books that I mention in my book is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is considered kind of the con artist's Bible. And it's also a Bible to a lot of businessmen and a lot of people who just want to be better at social interactions. So, I mean, if you actually parse what a con is, let's take away like the taking advantage of someone for your own ends and just look at the process. It's figuring out who someone is, gaining their trust, forming a relationship, and then having some sort of kind of, in the case of a con, it's for your benefit, but having some sort of mutual kind of connection there.
Well, you think about a con short for confidence.
Yeah.
So you don't want to go into so all of these situations are relationships of some sort.
Yeah.
You don't want to go into a relationship without building confidence.
Yeah.
You want to build confidence with whoever you're interacting with.
Exactly.
So it seems like these are universal themes, obviously.
Absolutely.
It seems what separates the con artist from, let's say, a functioning human being with good relationships is they have bad intent.
Yeah, they want to, taking advantage of others for your own ends. That's the crucial thing. So people have asked me, especially because I have a chapter devoted to religion, is all religion a con? And say, well, I'm not going to go so far as to say that. But I will say that the reason that religion emerges spontaneously in every society is the same reason we have con artists, because it's a very similar dynamic, this kind of need for belief, for relationships. And what separates the con artist from a genuine religious leader is, am I doing this for me to try to dupe people? Am I, a cult leader? Or am I kind of a leader that is using religion for some other ends? Or do I, is this really something that I want to do because I think it's going to make people's lives better?
Well, also, so take like a typical weekend all around the country. There's 1,000 spiritual retreats happening everywhere.
Yep.
And tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are going to them. So let's say you're going to a retreat. How do you, what are kind of typical, and you discuss cults and religion and so on with the chapter on David Sullivan. What are some typical kind of cult recognition techniques I can use the next time I'm in some sort of retreat?
Well, one of the things that Sullivan, or Sully as he was known, really stressed is that the modern cult is really difficult to spot. So he started doing this back in the 60s. He said it's so easy. You can find the guru and try and see right away that it's a cult. These days, it's a business retreat. People are sending their employees there. Everyone's wearing suits. It's all this like corporate thing, and it's a cult. And so one of the big signs is, are they trying to block access to the outside world?
Like how?
So
leave your phones at the door.
Leave everything, and you can't communicate. And if you communicate, you're somehow betraying the trust and the confidence of people here.
And you can make this argument that the problem of modern society is, too much constant multitasking and connection to the internet with all this BS information on it. So we're just going to clean ourselves of outside influence.
Well, and it's great that you said that, because one of the techniques that they often use is they'll lure you in through like a yoga retreat or like something that actually seems really legitimate. I mean, I'd go to a yoga retreat. That's great. I want to disconnect for a weekend and be in nature. And then you talk about, what we were talking about earlier with forging connections and kind of feeling some sort of bond of reciprocity. Then these people, they're nice. You had such a nice weekend. And then they take it to the next level. Well, now we're really going to cleanse you. That was just a weekend. And now all of a sudden, you can't leave, or you can leave. They never say, oh, you can't leave, but you kind of can't. And then they start kind of indoctrinating you. And I don't mean indoctrinating in the sense of this is what we believe in. But they start using different language, and you start speaking like them. And then
like what? What's an example?
I would say so you call someone like, what do you call the members of this society? Are you I don't know. I actually don't know what a cult would call you, but maybe you are I'm your spiritual guide, and you are kind of the spiritual devotee. And all of a sudden you're talking about guides and devotees. But basically, they start suddenly shifting your frame of reference so that you're no longer communicating in the same language as people outside. And slowly, they start stripping you of your connections to the outside world. This happens over time. And a lot of times, at first, people leave. They come in and out. It's not like they're forced to stay there, but eventually they don't anymore. And sometimes, you have cults where it's not like you're in one specific place. They operate all over the country. There's one very big one that I will not name because otherwise it will derail our whole conversation. But there you have people who seem to be leading normal lives, but you have very strict directives, what you can do, what you can say, who you can and can't communicate with, how you live your life. And you don't even realize that it's intrusive, because at that point you really truly believe it. So what Sullivan did is he would actually infiltrate the cult. He'd become a member because he realized that the only way to get people out was to speak with them in their language. You can't tell them you're in a cult, you need to get out. They won't listen to you. That's why most attempts are not successful.
How would he get people out? Because I saw in the book he would get people out, but you didn't quite say how, like what he would say to them to get them out.
He never said.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's not just because it's a trade secret, but because he just wanted to protect kind of those relationships. So he never said what he did exactly, but I think it was predicated on kind of appealing to them on the level that they know we're thinking on.
In the book, you mentioned actually a good friend of mine, Apollo Robbins, and you describe a trick he did, and it sounded fascinating. Can you describe the trick that he did on you?
So we were having dinner, during which I kept checking to make sure that all of my belongings were still on me.
Because he's a master pickpocket.
Yes,
the guy can take anything off of anything.
Yes, so we were having dinner where every 3 seconds I would go like this.
Right.
And actually just make sure everything was still intact. But he was trying to demonstrate, he was was helping me understand how some of these techniques work. And so he took just 3 random items from the dinner table. It was a salt shaker, remember a piece of lemon, and I don't remember an olive. And he said, I'm going to read your mind. I'm going to tell you which of these objects you're going to pick. And so he'd place a barrier between the objects and him. So, and then I would pick one of the objects, and he would figure out exactly what I took and in what hand it was. And this just he kept doing it over and over and over. Then he explained, I promised I wouldn't tell him how he did it. I wouldn't tell the world how he did it, but he explained it to me. And he said, I've actually been...
You picked he said,
he would
here are
say,
3 objects, put one in your hand, and then I'm going to guess which one you picked.
Exactly.
And he was always right.
And he was always right. And then he explained to me how he was very subtly changing how he talked to me and how he was directing me, basically, so that he knew by my answers, because we were having a conversation. It's not like it was silent. All the time there was chatter going on, which if you think about magic tricks, there's always back and forth. There's always chatter. There's always a story. That's the great magician. The great magician. And Apollo has both. He's both just a phenomenal sleight of hand artist and a phenomenal storyteller. But great magicians don't actually need to be as dexterous as he is. They can be brilliant just by holding people's attention. And I think one of the reasons Apollo actually is as good as he is at being able to take anything is that he can hold your attention, that everything is so honed. So basically we would be having a conversation, and he would know what I took because he told me what I took. And it took him multiple times of explaining this. And then he said, now try it on me. It was very difficult. He made it seem so effortless.
Is it like a statistical thing that basically over thousands of times with people,
No.
he knows what words trigger what objects?
Well, maybe for him that is, but it was basically in the specific directions that he gave me of how to choose objects.
It's fascinating.
It is. You can, I'm sure he would be delighted to tell you and to show you.
I'm going to ask.
But it's so funny. There's definitely a very close affinity between that kind of magic and cons.
So what's interesting to me too is your first book, How to Think Like, Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes, and The Art of Avoiding the Con are very similar. Because if you think about it, let's take a typical Sherlock Holmes case. The criminal is in plain sight, and it's a matter of Sherlock Holmes trying to figure out who that is. It's not a typical crime case where the criminal might completely disappear. So the criminal is in plain sight and pretending not to be a criminal, similar to a con artist. And it's through observation that he has to figure out how to be unconned in some sense, and figure out who the criminal is. And that's what someone who's avoiding a con has to do also. And a lot of it's related to, you kind of boil it down in this almost Zen way to mindfulness and what you also call observation with a capital O. But maybe describe some of the Sherlock Holmes techniques of observation and how we realistically can do them.
Well, I think the number one thing is trying to take a step back from your emotion, because our world is clouded by our emotions, how we're feeling, how someone makes us feel, how a situation makes us feel, how we're just generally feeling that day. And both criminals of the Holmes variety and con artists, and sometimes it's one and the same, they play on that. They actually excite your emotions. They are very good at eliciting certain feelings, which then cloud your judgment. It goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, storytelling, and why stories are so effective, because stories elicit emotions. The second you're emotional, you're no longer logical, you're no longer reasonable. And so Sherlock Holmes is very good. People say that he doesn't experience emotion. That's not true. What he does is he acknowledges it and says, okay, I'm not going to let it. I'm going to discount it. So yes, this is a beautiful woman, dear Watson, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We don't know anything about her. So let's just put that to the side, and let's acknowledge that she's making you feel like she's, the greatest gift to mankind ever. And we know that in a few stories you'll marry her, but that's okay. Let's just put that aside and focus on what she's saying. Let's focus on these sorts of things, like we were talking with the psychics and the cold reads. What are the cues that she's actually projecting? And let's try to go there. And the other thing that he does, which I think is very relevant to the modern world and would actually probably help you avoid getting conned, is to just be present to not be multitasking. Sherlock Holmes would not have an iPhone that he was constantly checking everywhere that he went. It's kind of that initial interaction with Watson where he knows everything about Watson. If he had been looking down at his phone and, just in his own world, that never would have happened. And we do it all the time. And I think that it's something that people have done all the time. I hate people who blame technology for it, and I'm not one of them. It's a very natural human tendency to try to multitask, and we don't like paying attention. It's hard because you have to focus, and you actually have to immerse yourself. And this has been a problem since medieval times. At least you have monks writing about how they can't pray. They call it the noonday demon, so it's not necessarily technology, but technology has made it much worse because now we have all of these outlets all the time for multitasking. And multitasking is the opposite of mindfulness, and it's the opposite of being observant enough so that you actually notice what's happening and you avoid being conned, avoid being taken advantage of.
So how can you practice that? How can you get better at mindfulness?
Well, one of the exercises that I always do myself, first I do meditate for not for very long, but like 10 minutes a day. And I think that that's incredibly useful. And there are lots of different styles of meditation. Different things work for different people. But I recommend actually doing one very simple, although it can be very challenging, experiment, which is go for a walk along the river or in a park, somewhere in nature without your phone. Without anything for an hour.
For an hour?
For an hour.
That's a big ask.
That's a big ask. Do it for 20 minutes if you don't have an hour. But just leave everything. An hour is a big ask, but I think you need the hour to actually start feeling what that does to you. Because all of a sudden, you have this moment of panic. I know that when I forget my phone at home, I feel very panicked, and I forget that I lived more than half my life with no smartphone and no cell phone, come to think of it. So I forget that this was very normal. Now I feel like, oh my God, I'm lost. Something terrible is going to happen. So it takes a while to get over that. And then you start noticing, because mindfulness isn't just noticing things about the environment, it's noticing things about yourself. It's being able to pay attention to your thoughts, what's going on inside your head, how you're feeling, to actually read your own body and your own emotions. Because the only way that you can then account for them and then you can make kind of accurate judgments is if you are able to understand yourself. And so many of us aren't. We don't pay attention to ourselves either.
In what way? Like,
you don't actually listen to the chatter in your head. You don't actually pay attention to what your body is telling you quite often, or what your mind is telling you.
What might my body tell me in a bad situation? Like, how will my body talk to me?
Well, your body might tell you that you're actually feeling physically uncomfortable and you're discounting it. And it might tell you, let me just give you like a very silly example. If you exercise and your body tells you, oh, you did something really wrong there, let's stop. You often don't even notice. You just keep, and then in retrospect, you're like, oh, when that happened, I probably should have stopped.
It's funny. I guess one time I had a boss, this is many years ago, and we kept going out to dinner, and I kept feeling really bad about myself by the time I got home.
Yeah.
Eventually I realized I have to quit this job.
Yeah.
I'm like just feeling bad about myself all the time. So stuff like that is important to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
How does this work in this is going to be kind of a naive question, but how does this work in dating? So obviously when you're on a date with somebody, both sides are presenting their best version of themselves. In some sense, I don't want to call it a con but you are trying to build confidence in the other person in what you're doing.
No, dating has a lot of parallels with cons.
So how can you be as sincere as possible and also kind of recognize the danger signals?
Well,
I know this is totally not the topic of your book, but I want to
know. No, it's actually really important. I think you need to, and this is really hard to say when you're actually in the situation, you have to be very aware of possible red flags, because you not only are presenting your best self, if you like the person, you want to see the best in them too at first. You have that kind of, and a lot of times some of the things that will become problems, it's very difficult to be totally different from the person you normally are over any extended period of time. 1 date, maybe. 2 dates, 3 dates, you'll probably start slipping up a little bit. And so you actually have to pay attention to some of these things. So I can give you an example of a woman I write about in the book who ended up moving in with a con artist who was an imposter and almost marrying him, which is, it's really scary to think that
Right.
might happen. And there were red flags, but she was so in love with him that she actually just dismissed them all out of hand.
I remember the story. Like, what were the red flags sort of appeared later? What were the red flags in the beginning?
Red flag number one, she never met any of his friends or anyone who knew him for more than a year. Everyone loved him, but they were all new acquaintances. There was no one old in his life. So no relationship over 6 months. Big red flag. But she just thought, oh, he's adventurous. He likes new things. He changed gears. Who knows?
So she was like Watson in that sense, that she got overwhelmed by kind of some good qualities.
Exactly.
And didn't really think about everything happening.
But that's a red flag. I mean, you want someone who has some sort of a history. And there are lots of things that it depends on you and kind of what's a red flag for you. If you're actually, that was a con, but if you're actually just talking about a relationship, is this person going to be right for me? That can be incredibly difficult. I mean, I would be a millionaire if I could sit here and tell you, these are the things you need to look out for.
Your next book.
My next book, How to Date Mindfully.
Right. Or The Con of Dating.
The Con of Dating. Excellent. You can co-author.
Yes, all right.
We can do.
I'll be I failed at all of it, so I'm the victim.
But it's really, it's a really tough question. So I went out with a practitioner of the game while I was doing this to try to see how a pickup artist works, because pickup artists, when you're actually being a pickup artist, that's a con. I mean, you're trying to take advantage of people for your own ends. And oh my God, this guy was so smooth. And then I was just a fly on the wall. He just let me, as long as he remained anonymous in the book, he was happy to let me watch him operate. And there was this one poor girl who was just completely smitten. And I felt really bad. So when he went to the bathroom I came up to her and I was like, just so you know, I'm a journalist. I'm writing about this guy. He's a pickup artist. Like
what did he do?
And well, hold on. What did she do? She just laughed at me and gave him her number anyway. And I mean, I was useless. I tried to do something good and it didn't work.
So look at me selfishly asking, what did he do? Like, I don't give a heck about her. Like, I wanted to know what he did.
He was really nice. He didn't even do any negging. You have negging, the kind of the big technique where you make someone feel bad about themselves so that then they feel like you're actually, you're there to make them feel better, even though they're the ones who made you feel bad in the first place. He didn't do that. He was just very charming and made it seem like she was the one who wanted him and not the other way around. Like, oh, I see that you're looking at me. I see. I'll be nice. I'll accommodate. Oh, you seem nice. Okay, I can make this work. Like, it's flipping it around, even though he's the one who targeted her. And then suddenly she doesn't know what to think. She says, oh, yeah, I have been interested in him. I was looking at him. I'm so glad that he reciprocates. It's a funny way to watch something unfold. And from the sidelines, and I was obviously unwittingly being a wing woman.
Wouldn't the reaction be, though, like, what are you talking about? I wasn't looking at you.
Well, it depends. You can't just say, I saw you looking at me. It's the way that you present it. You don't say, I saw you looking at me. You say, oh, hey, how are you? You basically approach and make it clear that you're approaching because there was interest there. I'm not a pickup artist. I can't reciprocate. I can't replicate the relationship. And so much of it actually isn't in words. It's what I was saying earlier, the nonverbal signals that can be very powerful. So much of it is communicated that way, especially when you talk about relationships and attraction and something like that. And it's really, so much of that is based on very primitive signals that are kind of on a much deeper level than any sort of cognitive factors, that it becomes really difficult to say, okay, well, what are you supposed to look out for? And I think, my answer is ultimately you don't know, and you kind of have to put yourself out there and see what happens, and sometimes it'll work out.
I think the mindfulness thing is very important on the victim side, and I think attempting to be sincere as opposed to like gaming it.
Yeah.
I think just for the sake of both sides, because you're not going to end up in a good relationship if you had to persuade someone to be in a relationship with you.
Absolutely. And it was only, it took me a long time to figure that out. That, it's really exhausting.
That'll be the subject of a whole other podcast.
Yeah. It's really exhausting not being yourself.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Maria Konnikova, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. The Confidence Game, I really think people should read it. Like, it was inspiring to me. I wanna protect myself, and I also wanna make sure I'm never conned. I never am a con man, because I think it's both sides I got scared of. And then Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. People should read that. I'm gonna actually do a second pass on that myself, because I didn't really fully read it. But thanks again for coming on the show. And your next book, you have to come back.
I would love to. Thanks for having me. This is one of the best interviews I've ever done.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you.
For more from James, check out The James Altucher Show on the Choose Yourself Network at jamesaltucher.com and get yourself on the free insiders list today.
Hey, thanks for listening. Listen, I have a big favor to ask you, and it will only take 30 seconds or less, and it would mean a huge amount to me. If you like this podcast, please let me know. Please let the team I work with know. Please let my guests know. And you can do this easily by subscribing to the podcast. It's probably the biggest favor you could do for me right now, and it's really simple. Just go to iTunes, search for The James Altucher Show, and click subscribe. Again, it will only take you 30 seconds or less, and if you subscribe now, it will really help me out a lot. Thanks again.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.